Stop that noise. What is that?
Okay, I think we're ready to get started. First of all, I have to apologize to everyone. We had a technical difficulty getting started, but we're all set now. And thanks everyone for your patience and for the delayed start here. So anyway, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another virtual event of the Bastiat Society of Washington, D.C. My name is Steve Dewey, and I am the chapter director of our Washington, D.C. chapter of the Bastiat Society. The Bastiat Society is the public outreach program of the American Institute for Economic Research, otherwise known by its acronym AIER. The purpose of the Bastiat Society is to educate and promote the ideals of free market economics and sound money, personal liberty, and a free and civil society. The Bastiat Society has now grown to 42 chapters around the world. We keep growing. We just, I think, added a couple more chapters overseas. We have 17 chapters in the United States, 25 chapters in foreign countries. If you'd like to learn more about AIER and the Bastiat Society, our website address is aier.org. Today, I'm very honored and excited to have Bob Woodson as our featured speaker. Mr. Woodson is based in Washington, D.C. and is president and founder of the Woodson Center that he established in 1981. In February of this year, he started the 1776 Unites movement to counter the 1619 project developed by the New York Times last year in 2019. In his talk today, Mr. Woodson will discuss 1776 Unites as an effort to speak for Americans of all races, creeds, and political convictions who oppose the efforts to demoralize and demonize the United States by the 1619 project and its foundations from within, and to turn its people, the American people, against one another with false history and grievance politics. Mr. Woodson will elaborate on the 1776 Unites movement as an effort to achieve solutions to America's greatest challenges in education, culture, and upward mobility based on America's founding principles. Mr. Woodson has been an influential leader on issues of poverty alleviation and empowering disadvantaged communities to become agents of their own uplift. He has been a frequent advisor to local, state, and federal government officials, as well as businesses and philanthropic organizations dating back to the 1960s civil rights movement. Mr. Woodson appears frequently as a social commentator in print and on-air media, including C-SPAN, CNN, Tucker Carlson Tonight, Lou Dobbs Tonight, Meet the Press, and other national and local broadcasts. He's also a contributing editor to The Hill, The Washington Examiner, The Wall Street Journal, and has published articles in Forbes, National Review, The Washington Post, the Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy, and many others. Mr. Woodson is also the author of several books, including On the Road to Economic Freedom, published in 1987, and The Triumphs of Joseph, How Today's Community Healers Are Reviving Our Streets and Neighborhoods, published in 1998. And he has a new book scheduled for release this December entitled Lessons from the Least of These, The Woodson Principles. So we're very honored to have Mr. Woodson speak to us today, and we do encourage questions from attendees. We will allocate at least 30 minutes for a Q&A session with attendees once Mr. Woodson has concluded his talk. Attendees will be muted throughout the course of the event, so questions from attendees will be submitted in writing, and I will read the questions as they are submitted by attendees. And now I turn it over to Bob Woodson. Bob, please proceed.
Well, pleased to join you, and after our little technical glitches, hope we can enjoy it. But I am speaking to you as a veteran of the civil rights movement, having done my civil rights work in Westchester, Pennsylvania. It's a town about 30 miles west of Philadelphia and the home of Bayard Rustin. And so I was able to meet Dr. King through Bayard Rustin, having a young civil rights worker. So I come at this from that perspective. Just a little background. The Black community is often portrayed in the press as a monolith, but it's just not true. As a young civil rights lawyer, I parted company with the civil rights movement over the issue of forced busing for integration, also the role of low-income people. I remember that we picketed for 3 months outside of a pharmaceutical company, and when they desegregated, they hired 9 Black PhD chemists. And they said we got these jobs because we were qualified, not because of the sacrifices of others. So I realized there was a serious class clash within the Black community. And that clash continues to this day, that many of the people who suffered and sacrificed most did not benefit from the change. So Dr. King was saying that the highest form of maturity of any people or a nation is the ability to be self-critical. And so the civil rights movement at that time was served by the quality of the debate within it as to the path forward. There were some who believed that protests, civil disobedience, but there was vigorous debate within the civil rights movement. But the spirit of that debate always took place with the confidence that America was being challenged in the civil rights movement to live up to its ideals. It wasn't an attack on those ideals, virtues, and principles. It was to fulfill them. But there's always been an attempt on the part of the left to challenge those virtues. Even in the 60s, there was a challenge. There were attempts, for instance, in the 30s and 40s to recruit Blacks into the Communist Party, but because the communists were godless and America were Christian, Black Americans were Christian-centered, those efforts were resisted. But of late, what we're witnessing now is really an assault on this struggle that we have around race and slavery. The history of slavery really has very little to do with race. That may be a surprising statement. It really is an attempt on the part of the left to promote Marxist approach in our society, but they're using the prism of race to accomplish that. For example, when Freddie Gray, the man who was killed by a police officer in Baltimore, and there was a controversy about that, and then Michael Brown in Ferguson occurred, there was America's issue was inflamed and riots occurred. And now George Floyd. And what the left has done is really exploit something that America is deeply passionate about, and that is the guilt around the whole institution of slavery and discrimination. This is deeply felt. And so the left has attached itself to something that is deeply felt by the, but they're using the Black community, and it's a legitimate concern about social justice, to really using it as a bludgeon against the nation. And so what we have done is recognize that this separation, that they're really exploiting it, because right after George Floyd, there were riots. The peaceful protests devolved into riots. And so what the Black Lives Matter did, that was supposed to be champions of, betrayed the very people in whose name it was advancing this cause for justice. Evidence of that betrayal is that they soon switched from seeking justice for Blacks. They migrated to assaulting the nuclear family. They burned Bibles, the Christian Bible in Portland. There was an attack to tear down the symbol of the Christian cross as being a symbol of white supremacy. They went after the symbols of American valor by desecrating the memorials to Second World War veterans, and even to Frederick Douglass in Rochester, New York. His statue was desecrated as well. And then recently, Roosevelt and Abraham Lincoln, their statues were torn down in Portland as well. So it's obvious that what the left is doing is using America's legitimate concern and passion about race to exploit that. And 1619 is the culmination of decades long of the accumulation of these indictments against the country. And that's when these Black journalists at the New York Times assembled other Black journalists, and they wrote a tract that says that America's birth date should be 1619, the day that the first 20 Black African slaves arrived on our shores. And as a consequence of America's, I called its birth defect of slavery, America should be forever defined and condemned by that history. And therefore, in there, they said that America, capitalism and racism are synonymous, and America was built on the foundation of injustice, and that racism is in its DNA and present in all institutions, and that therefore all white people have benefited and therefore are privileged as a consequence of this exploitation, and therefore they should be punished, and all Blacks and people of color are perpetual victims to be compensated. And they leave it at that. And as a consequence, unfortunately, they're in their assault on the fundamentals of the country, they are really betraying the Black community, because by perpetuating what I call poetic truths. By poetic truth, there are myths about it. They are taking a limited number of incidents like these Black men who were killed by police and were unarmed, and they're extrapolating that to associate those actions with all police. They're saying all police are therefore tools of white supremacy, and then they go back into the past of Emmett Till or something and say, and then join this in a narrative to say America was racist in its past, and those patterns of racism continue to today, and therefore American institutions and virtues are invalid, as well as the Declaration of Independence, and therefore what is needed is to replace this country. So we are at a real crisis, and unfortunately, many corporations and philanthropic organizations are contributing to that demise by making hundreds of millions of dollars available to these groups to destroy this nation. It was, I think, Samuel Adams said that a general dissolution of principles and manners will more shortly overthrow the liberties of America than the whole force of a common enemy. While the people are virtuous, they cannot be subdued. But when they lose their virtue, they will be ready to surrender their liberties to the first external or internal invaders. For as virtue and knowledge is diffused among the people, they will never be enslaved, and this will be their great security. And he ended by saying that neither the wisest constitution nor the wisest laws will serve the liberty and happiness of a people whose manners are universally corrupt. So the left understands that our strength is also our weakness. And so what we believe we did, since they are using race and racial grievance and the plight of Black America as a bludgeon to denigrate this country, we decided that the messenger to answer that has to also come from the Black community. So what we did at the Woodson Center, we assembled 23 plus scholars, but activists to come together for us to counter their argument, their poetic truth with facts-based truth, but not to engage in a debate with them, but to offer an aspirational and an inspirational or alternative narrative to debunk their lies that are contained in 1619. For example, one of the biggest myths that fuels this whole controversy is that the problems of out of wedlock births, of unemployment rate high, the violence in the Black community is somehow related to a legacy of slavery and discrimination. And therefore, the only answer is reparations. Well, what we have done is go back to debunk that proposition that the current problems of Black America, of out of wedlock births and violence in the community is directly related to that legacy. And we refute that by offering proof that at the end of slavery, a study of 6 plantations revealed that 75% of those slave families had a man and a woman raising children. And for over a century, the 2-parent households were intact up into 1962, 63. Another evidence of so the Blacks are never defined by slavery, but by resilience and perseverance and victory over oppression. In other words, what they have left out of the history of Black America is our capacity to achieve in the face of slavery. For example, in 1920 to 1940, the education gap in the South was 3 years, 8th grade for whites, 5th grade for Blacks. But because Booker T. Washington and Julius Rosenwald, the CEO of Sears, partnered, they put up $4.2 million. And they worked with low-income rural Black leaders, and they built 5,000 Rosenwald schools. And as a consequence, of building of these 5,000 Rosenwald schools, they were able to, in 20 years, reduce the education gap from 3 years to 6 months, even though the textbooks were used. So the question is, if under de jure segregation, when they were operating on a fraction of the money, the Black community could close the education gap in the South between whites and Black. And why can't we do it today when these educational institutions are well-funded and run by Blacks? Another point that we make in our essays dealing with marriage. A lot of the decline that we're witnessing in the inner city has to do with the dissolution of the 2-parent households. Between 1930 and 1940, during the Depression, when the unemployment rate among the general population was 25%, and in the Black community, unemployment rate was more like 40%. But even in the presence of conditions where there was no Black political representation, racism was enshrined in law. The Black community had a higher marriage rate than any other group in society. Elderly people could walk safely in their communities without fear of being assaulted by their grandchildren. If racism were the principal culprit, then why were communities safer and more stable there than they are today when these same cities have been run by Black leadership over the past 50 years? And so these are the troubling questions that refuse to be debated, because the left has successfully convinced America of these untruths. And so what we believe the answer is, the sleeping giant in America are low-income Blacks. And so what we're doing at 1776 is we are issuing a curriculum. The 1619 has produced curriculum from these poetic truths that denigrates America, that they're saying to our young urban kids that meritocracy is racist, delayed gratification is racist, that personal responsibility is blaming the victim. And these negative messages are now enshrined in curriculum that is being taught in all of the school systems, 50 states. So what we're doing in 1776 is that we are issuing our own K through 12 curriculum. We've issued the first 3 lessons, and in less than 7 days, there are 5,000 downloads. When 1619 had about 4,500 in a year, we've had 5,000 downloads. 70% are from educators. There's a thirst in America to get their hands on an accurate, uplifting, affirmative curriculum base that tells the truth about America. America has never been defined by its birth defect of slavery, but the promise that is enshrined in 1776 in the Declaration of Independence and in our Constitution. And therefore, the very people who are most victimized by this assault on those virtues are low-income Blacks, because as the police are vilified and they withdraw from these communities, it results in an increase in violence in these communities. And so the left and their conspirators in the media looks the other way at violence in these cities, and also they're complicit in vilifying the police. But the Black community are the ones who are losing children. For every white person, in the course of a year, there may be 14 to 20 Blacks who are unarmed shot by the police, but you would never know that. But there are 7,000 killed by other Blacks. And so we believe it is important to give the low-income Blacks in those communities the information they need to speak for themselves. One of the best ways that we can undermine the moral authority of these extreme leftists is to give a voice to the people in whose name they say they are pursuing social justice. So that 80% of the Black community does not support the reduction or defunding of police. They challenge this notion that so-called institutional racism really is the foundation, is the basis of inequities that exist today. And companies and school systems are being compelled, like in a fascist society, to sign on the line that they have racial guilt training. And so we are attacking this, but we want to give voice to low-income people. The mothers of children who have lost people in the Black community will rise up and say that Black Lives Matter does not speak for us. And so what we believe we should do is we need to fully support institutions within the Black community whose lives are built upon the foundation of our traditional values. For instance, for an example, there's a 110-year-old school called Pineywood. It's a Black boarding school in Mississippi that was started by Lawrence Jones, a man who was the first graduate, Black to graduate University of Iowa. He started this school. They only accept children at high risk, but 95% of the kids go on to college from this school. But they have mandatory chapel, they have uniforms, the kids are required to do 10 hours of work. In other words, they are a model of traditional American values and action. And there are other institutions that are pushing back against the race grievance narrative. And therefore, what we believe we should happen as a society, we must reassert the importance of these institutions, particularly in the Black community, so that they can rise up. And I think low-income Blacks represent a rich reservoir of patriots that will join back and push back against the oppression that is coming from the left to destabilize this country. As Samuel Adams said, when the virtues of our country are infused in the general population, they will not be defeated. But in order for us, we must reward virtue in action in these communities by providing as much funding to the programs and efforts, institutions within these communities that embody those principles, as the left is funding those that are denigrating these principles. I'll stop there and take whatever questions you may have.
Okay. Is anyone? Well, I'll start off with a couple questions of my own. I'm curious about the origins of the 1619 project. So I understand it was kind of originated by the New York Times.
Yes.
So do you know, like, are there certain individuals that you may be aware of that are?
Hannah Nicole Jones is one of she's the organizer of it.
Oh,
and,
okay.
And she is the organizer of it, and she assembled a group of journalists. And it's very interesting because of the kind of backlash she's getting from both the left and the right. She's recently rescinded this notion. One of the fundamental propositions that she advocated is that 1619 is legitimate, should be the birthday of America. Now she's recanted that and said she was speaking metaphorically. And so she has backtracked on that. And as a result, there are about 23 scholars that have written a letter to the Pulitzer demanding that they rescind the Pulitzer Prize because she acted unethically, and also she's perpetuating lies, even though the New York Times refused to recall the many, many thousands of magazines that have been used by the Pulitzer Institution to develop public school curriculum. So right now, public school kids are being taught from a curriculum that the author of it has said it isn't true.
Yeah, and when we talked yesterday, we also talked a little bit about how a lot of these problems seem to start with LBJ's Great Society in the 1960s, and LBJ had the War on Poverty, and I'd seen some articles about that in recent years about how costly it has been, the war on poverty. I forget, it's so many trillions of dollars, but yet it hasn't really seemed to do anything. In fact, it's been counterproductive.
It really did. Thomas Sowell documented the fact that in 1940, the poverty rate in the Black community was like 82%. But within 10 years, it declined to 46%. And then the next 10 years, it declined another 18%. So poverty in the Black community was declining before government got involved. But what happened when government got involved on the war on poverty, they spent $22 trillion in the last 50 years, where 70% of every dollar goes not to the poor, but those who serve the poor. And they ask which problems are fundable, not which ones are solvable. And so when you've created a whole class of people who are serving the poor, you then created a commodity out of poor people.
Right.
And as a result of some of those policies, the war on poverty has been more injurious to the Black community than anything that happened during Jim Crow period, during segregation. Because at least segregation was external. What the war on poverty did was tore apart the family.
Right.
That when of 50 years of war on poverty, the Black community's nuclear family went from 75% down to less than 30%. Something that did not happen during all the era of slavery and discrimination. Even during slavery, families were whole.
Right.
But they couldn't survive the war on poverty.
Right. We're getting some questions now from our attendees. Let's see. There's a couple from Wayne Abernathy. Wayne, thanks for attending and for your questions. So Wayne asked a question here. Your timing of the data that show the assault on Black families would seem to point to policy of the Great Society. Okay, that's just what we were talking about as contributing to that breakup. Yeah, I think we just hit on that. And then Wayne has another question. He asks, would not the reparations movement, if applied, start once again to trap people just like the war on poverty?
Well, it's such a ridiculous proposition. First of all, there were free Blacks who owned slaves. There were Native Americans, the 5 civilized tribes. They owned thousands of slaves. Well, do the offsprings of those who slave owners who were free Blacks and Indians, do they pay? What about the whites who came here after slavery at the turn of the century? I mean, it's such a ridiculous proposition that it's hardly worth the time to discuss, but I think it's a real distraction.
Right.
It really is.
Okay, I got another question here from John Baltimore. John, thanks. So Bob, John's question is, Bob, before COVID's impact on the inner city economies and elsewhere, did we see any evidence of economic uplift as a result of the 2017-18 tax cuts and regulations helping not only Black incomes, but other important social measures such as crime rates, educational attainment, et cetera? Perhaps there wasn't adequate time to see measurable impact yet.
No, it was over these past few years before the pandemic, the unemployment rate in the Black community was at its lowest in decades.
Right.
Income was up. People benefited from it, and they celebrated that it was the lowest. And so the assumption is, and it's so insulting and patronizing, that Black people don't think of anything but race.
Yeah, right.
Now, we get up every morning thinking of, oh, okay, what are they going to do to us this morning? We don't. There have been surveys done over the course of 12 years when ordinary Blacks were asked, what are the issues important to you? Race only came in less than 8%. But you would never know that if you listen to the media.
Right.
That the only thing, and politicians make the mistake that by pandering to race,
Right. Yeah. Okay, I got another question here from Robert Gay. Robert, thank you. His question is, it seems the mainstream media has allied itself to be allied with the leftist viewpoint. I think that's an understatement. So what can we do when the populace has itching ears and only wants to hear this narrative? Second, it seems like the war on poverty is like the economic development plans and policy that concentrates on growth, but not on the development of institutional changes needed. What do you think of this?
Yeah, I think that the reality is that any group's participation in the American economy is always dependent upon their small business formation rate. You know that only 2.5 or 3% of the population are entrepreneurs. They generate 70% of the jobs. And if you trace every ethnic group, Japanese American have the lowest unemployment rate because they have the highest business formation rate. And something else that may surprise folks when people are talking about, oh, institutional racism prevents Blacks from competing. Well, if you were to disaggregate the Black community and look at Nigerians and Caribbeans, you will find that Nigerian Americans are outperforming whites in almost every category. 48% have college degrees. They have whole families. their income are higher than whites. If institutional racism were a factor, why are Nigerians and Caribbean, second generation Caribbeans outperforming whites in this society if institutional racism were a factor of life?
Right. Right. Okay, I got another question here from Wayne Abernathy. Wayne's question is, I am inspired by your message that there is a great unharnessed energy and resource in poor Black communities. To what extent might your educational efforts find support in efforts to allow Black communities to get better education through vouchers, education vouchers? We need these people who are largely outside of the economy brought fully into the economy.
You're absolutely right. Again, poll after poll indicate that the lower the income of Black community, the higher their support for vouchers and choice. We
Right.
were at the very center of the voucher movement in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, with Polly Williams and the Bradley Foundation. So low-income Blacks have been strong supporters of choice in education. And in fact, if Republicans were smart, they would wake up in 2018 and the gubernatorial race in Florida was DeSantis against Gillum, the Black mayor of Tampa. Well, DeSantis won by 32,000 votes. And that's because 100,000 low-income Blacks split their ticket and voted for him because he was a strong supporter of education vouchers. Even though Gillum had Barack Obama and Oprah Winfrey come in to campaign for him. So 100,000 low-income Blacks not only voted for Republican, but voted against Oprah and voted against Obama. But that fact seemed to have gotten lost in it. That to me says to me that Black Americans are getting more sophisticated in voting their interest above race and Black celebrity.
Right. One thing that I was intrigued by when we were in one of our discussions, one of the discussions I had with you, you were talking about even during the segregation days. I don't know exactly what decades or you were might have been referring to, maybe like in the 50s or 40s or 50s or
right after slavery.
Yeah.
Up until to the 1960s. Yeah, that whole period.
But I was intrigued when you were talking. I think the term you used was Black Wall Street or Black Wall Street.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, this is again the myth that the left keeps perpetuating, that somehow redlining and all of these segregation laws prevented us from prospering. It was just not the case. In Tulsa, Oklahoma, in a period after slavery, within 40 years, they built the Greenwood section of Tulsa was the Black Wall Street. We had insurance companies, we had hotels. There were 5 men who owned their own airplanes in 1920, living in Tulsa. Durham, North Carolina, in the Hayti section was also another Black Wall Street. That when Blacks were denied access to hotels, we built our own. There was the Wallahaji in Atlanta, the Carver and the Calvert Hotel in Miami, the St. Teresa in New York, and the St. Charles in Chicago. I could go on and on. When we were denied access, for instance, in Chicago, in the Bronzeville section of Chicago in 1929, there was 731 Black-owned businesses, and Blacks had $100 million in real estate assets. And so there's one Black businessman, as I mentioned, that you'll know when I tell you his name, that he was born, Elijah McCoy was born to fugitive slave parents, and they made it to Canada, where he was raised and educated and became an engineer. And he came to the United States and applied for a job at the railroad in 1848. They gave him, because of his color, the worst and most dangerous job, and that is oiling the wheels on the train. Well, he invented a machine that automatically lubricated the wheels, and he became wealthy. And then there were other businesses that tried to develop knockoffs. And the owners of the company said, no, we want the real McCoy. So that expression comes from Elijah McCoy. He is in the Inventors Hall of Fame. He had 51 patents to his name.
Wow. Wow.
And there are other exciting stories of Blacks who have taken the worst that was given to them and created. We had almost many Blacks who were born slaves who died millionaires.
Yeah, I remember one really fascinating story you told. I think it might have been at the Hillsdale College event about the Black woman back in the 1800s who
Biddy Mason.
Sorry?
Biddy Mason.
She was born a slave and then she became
1818. She was born in Mississippi. 1818. At 17, sold to a slave master, and she walked behind a wagons for 1,000 miles from Mississippi to Salt Lake City with 3 children, attending to the sheep. And when she got to Salt Lake City, they moved again to California. That's a free state. And therefore she filed suit and got her freedom. And she delivered, she was a midwife, and earned about $1.50 a day, and saved her money for 10 years and purchased land downtown Los Angeles then, and built a house and then rented another one. And next thing you know, she had a complex of real estate. She became a philanthropist and also the founder of the AME church that's still in existence today. And she died with a net value on today's dollars of about $6 million.
Wow, fascinating story. So we got a couple more questions here. Let's see, this is from Rick Hotchner. Rick, thanks for your question. It says, he says, seems like Americans who happen to be Black have multiple reasons to vote Republican. However, they vote overwhelmingly for Democrats. What do you think can be done about that? Especially, let's see, he says, vote for, especially after the last several months where inner cities were destroyed and Democrat leaders remained passive.
Well, first of all, I think I gave you one example in Florida where the Republicans offered an agenda. Another, one of the most celebrated men that I know was Dick Riordan, a conservative white Republican in Los Angeles, who probably in 1988, he came into East LA. This is a low-income Hispanic neighborhood, and started working with a liberal Democratic nun, Sister Jenny Lichtenberg, who had a series of after-school programs. He recruited some of his friends and built a state-of-the-art facility for them. And then 2 years later, in 1990, he declared for the mayor's race. He made his announcement at the Riordan Center, and he became the first Republican in 35 years to be elected to the mayor's race. And when he ran for re-election, he won 60% of almost every demographic. That's because Dick Riordan understood that if you plant charitably, you can harvest politically, but you don't harvest and plant in the same year. Republicans don't show up in these communities.
Yeah, I think I can actually add to the answer to Rick's question. And this is something, again, that you and I were just talking about yesterday, about why Blacks have been voting overwhelmingly Democrat. It goes back to, it really started in the 1960s with LBJ,
Right.
with LBJ's Great Society programs. That's what as we were talking about, LBJ actually made a comment back in 1964, 65, when he was trying to implement the Great Society programs. He actually made a comment that the Democrats will have the black vote for the next 200 years.
Right.
Um, but so I think that that's, that I think is what caused a lot of blacks to start voting Democrat. But now I think that trend is, that dynamic is changing.
It really is. And the greatest inhibitor of black voting is not having to require an ID. It is apathy. If you go into these cities like Washington, D.C., Trenton, Newark, in the mayor's race and local officials, the turnout in these high crime areas is like 6%, because they feel so turned off because they haven't, they're banana republics in these cities. But people like Steve Goldsmith came in Indianapolis, and he ran and was successful. And as I said, Dick Riordan did. But my criticism of conservatives have been, they don't have a ground game.
Yeah.
They're great with ideas, but people are more motivated by evidence of your truth, not an intellectual recitation of it.
Right, like producing a lot of white papers.
Yes, absolutely. Someone said a little joke. He says that there was a man drowning. He was 10 feet from the shore. A liberal came along and said, "Oh, he's 10 feet from the shore. I'm going to give him 20 feet of rope, but I'm not going to tie it to the dock." A conservative came along and said, "Oh, he's 10 feet. I'm going to give him 5 feet of rope and let him swim the other 5 feet." A neoconservative comes along and sees a man drowning and goes back and writes a column about it.
Okay. Okay, that's a good one. Okay, so we got a couple more questions here. This is from John Bodymore. The question is, might the Rosenwald schools, a story, inspire something similar today, or is the voucher fight the best way to improve education for blacks?
We need a multi-pronged approach. I think what I'm trying to do is say to conservative funders, these schools like the Pineywood School, and there are 4 others like them, that have as their foundation Christian values and virtues, but they're struggling financially. Conservatives should flood these schools with financial support. So you need to really support institutions that embody the principles and values that you cherish. Then we should make them reward them, because liberals are going to punish them. And so they must be indemnified. We saw this with the KIPP schools. That was started 20 years ago to provide a safe haven for inner city kids. Now they have just capitulated and said that personal responsibility and meritocracy are no longer, they're white and therefore no longer taught at the KIPP school. Well, this is betrayal. So we need to support vouchers. We need to fund and provide support for schools that exist in communities and neighborhood groups whose efforts, like these Black mothers, who are pushing back against the left's intrusion into the police department. When they are advocating support of police, they need to be funded and supported.
Okay, I got another question here from Rick Hotchner. Rick's question is, what kind of outreach are you doing to disseminate the 1776 curriculum? Besides donations, how can we support the mission of 1776 Unites?
Well, what I've asked people to do, we have a new PR firm that is helping us to get our message out. but also I'm asking supporters what they're doing. Some supporters are doing is not only are they contributing to us, but we're having Zoom meetings where they invite their friends. So we can have conversations like we're having now. We would be delighted to have you host a Zoom meeting so we can take your friends on a journey so you can deepen their understanding. Also, we have about 2,500 grassroots leaders in 39 states. And so we're asking people who want to volunteer to help those groups to let us know. And then we will try to connect them with people who want to come in and do something supportive of those.
Okay, let's see. Got another question here. Okay, this is also from Rick Hotchner. He says, thanks for your answer about why Black Americans happen to vote Democrat. It says, it seems there are more Black Republican candidates running in inner cities this year. I can think of Kim Klacik, for example, in Baltimore.
Yes.
And also Burgess Owens in Utah.
Good friend.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I like him. So Rick's question is, do you agree and do you think increasing inroads into these communities will result in more Black Republican candidates? I guess.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I just think, as I gave you those examples with DeSantis and other, Steve Goldsmith did the same thing in Indianapolis. He privatized public services and contracted with local Black churches who hired teenagers to maintain the local parks. Mm-hmm. And that developed a sense of ownership of those parks. And so when a Republican politician gets in office and looks for creative ways to support local neighborhoods, they will win elections. But they have to show up. They have to do more than write white papers and then go on Fox to complain about what the left is doing.
Mm-hmm. Right. See, a question that I have, and again, we touched on this a little bit yesterday. So President Trump got about 8% of the Black vote in 2016. I think he's really been trying to promote what he's done for the African Americans in the United States over the last 3.5 years. Do you have a sense? Can you comment at all on how much Trump can increase his Black vote percentage in 2020, up from 8% in 2016?
I would not be surprised if he did not get 20%, 22% of the Black vote right now. Because I guess what I love about him, he is not a guilty white man.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, there are two people who are the bane of my existence, and that is self-flagellating guilty white people and rich, angry, entitled Blacks peddling their victims' books. Mm. Those are the two groups that have weaponized race in America and turned it into a political weapon without it benefiting the Black community at all.
Yeah.
See, yeah. So someone says the charge of something is institutional racism, like I heard Kamala Harris and Biden say, they need to be asked, okay, give me an example of it. And then what is your solution for it? And how does that solution affect improving the well-being of young Blacks in these inner cities? See, that should be the question. And don't just leave up there to say, oh, we have an institutional racism. But give me an example. What is your solution? Then how does that remedy help to improve the conditions of the least of God's children? Mm-hmm. See, our goal at the Woodson Center in 1776 is to de-racialize race and desegregate poverty.
Right. Well, Martin Luther King Jr. was the one who wanted to de-racialize race,
Right.
right? So, okay, got another question here from James Bond. Thanks, James. This question is, do you find that there are significant differences in the receptivity of your message between elderly, middle-aged, and younger Blacks? That's a good question. It does seem that many younger Blacks are beginning to question the left orthodoxy. Many younger Blacks are probably more influenced by the culture which skews left.
Yeah, I think the younger Blacks don't know about the civil rights movement. But I think there's a danger too, because they don't know about, they are more open to this, the message that America is racist and therefore capitalism is evil. It's like a survey done many years ago when they asked some kids in a wealthy school if they know about poverty, and the little boy said, yeah, I'm poor, the chauffeur is poor, the maid is poor, the gardener is poor. There's a sense of unreality to it. But no, I think younger Blacks, the very fact that you have some of these rappers, 50 Cent and others, are casting about, talking positively about Trump and challenging others, is a good sign.
Yeah. I think we're getting close to 2:15 here, but one question I have, and maybe this week we can wrap it up with one question that I have. So there's several Black Americans that I admire, like yourself, that I assume you probably know all of them. Like I think about Shelby Steele and Thomas Sowell and Dr. Ben Carson. And I was wondering if maybe you could speak about some of the Black Americans that you personally admire and have good relationships with.
Well, all of them are friends. I've met a lot of these new young scholars, Ian Rowe out of New York, Coleman Hughes, a young man who just graduated from Columbia University and now is with Manhattan Institute. They're just, in fact, on our website, we have all of them listed, 1776 Unites.
Oh.
And if you go on our website, we also have a library of books that we recommend, not just the ones written by us, but also written by others, like Fred Siegel, The Future Once Happened Here, very important book. James C. Scott, Seeing Like a State. So if you go on our website, 1776 Unites, you will see a whole library of recommended readings that are very uplifting and inspirational.
Oh.
And so that's what we hope. People are inspired when you show them victories that are possible, not injuries to be avoided.
Okay, well that's, yeah, we'll have to check out those names and all the other information you have on your website, 1776unites.org, right?
.com.
Oh, .com, okay, 1776unites.com.
Yes.
Okay.
All right.
Okay, well, Bob, I really appreciate your taking the time. This has been a terrific discussion, and I really want to support you and wish you all the best with 1776 Unites and what you're
Thank you. I enjoyed the exchange.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Bob, and all the attendees. Thank you for attending, and have a good rest of the day.
All right.